Lots of people build tribal commander decks, but not all tribes are as equal as others. So I want to take some time to highlight some of the lesser play tribes and why they struggle in commander, along with some ways you could build them a little bit better. In this video, we'll be looking at the Wurm tribe, which recently received a new commander in Dominaria United. So we'll try and work out, are Wurms playable? Now, when I say tribal, I'm talking about decks that have a commander with a type that all or most of the creatures in the deck also share. We are also generally looking to avoid running too many things like changelings, as that kind of defeats the purpose of a tribal deck. In Magic, Wurms, with a U instead of an O, are generally gigantic worm-like creatures with large stat lines and mana costs. They are predominantly found in green, however there are several black, white and red examples as well, with some of the most well known being Massacre Wurm, Wurmcoil Engine, Worldspire Wurm, Pelakka Wurm, and Novablast Wurm. But when it comes to Wurm commanders, well, things are suddenly much more difficult. There is only one legendary worm to be found, Growth Armor, all devouring. And Growth Armor isn't actually very good for Wurm Tribal, as the abilities are mostly to do with self-damage rather than helping us play out our other big friends. Dominaria, however, has given us a new choice, with Baru Wurm Speaker. Baru is obviously an attempt to make a Wurm Tribal commander, with abilities that buff worms, and another that can create worms for a fairly low cost if you already have one out. Outside of these, however, we quickly end up falling into the more generalized commanders that just cheat big creatures into play. These include Atlapalani, who can turn eggs into worms if built that way, Mael the Anima, who cheats in big creatures from the top of your library, and Hans Eriksson, who does much the same. There is of course Morofong, the everything tribal commander, along with Moretti of the Frost as other potential choices. However, Changeling commanders have always felt like the last choice you want to make for a tribal commander deck. But this leaves us in a tough place. If you're a tribal purist, where all the creatures in the commander need to be the same tribe type, well, your only choice is Growth Armor. If you can stretch your tribe out to include Baru, since he cares about worms, he becomes the obvious tribal choice. However, that comes with the downsides of being the wrong creature type, so cards like Path of Ancestry, Descendant's Path, and Steely Resolve aren't really going to work as well, since our commander won't be of the right creature type. So our choices in commander are pretty limited unless we want to branch into the more generic commanders that don't really have anything to do with the tribe. So for now, let's just assume we're sticking with Growth Armor or Baru and building a fairly green or mono-green deck. Next up, let's talk about the creatures in the tribe. There are 96 worms in the history of Magic, and 68 if we're restricted to only mono-green. This should mean we have plenty of choice when putting a deck together. However, the tribe suffers from what I call the angel problem. It is a handful of low-cost worms which are truly terrible and really aren't playable even in Commander. They either have a very poor stat line, really bad downsides, or a mix of both. It's not until you get up to around the 5-cost worms that you start seeing some more playable creatures. However, a creature curve that starts at 5 is not really something you want to do in Commander. There is also a lot of draft chaff in the tribe, big vanilla creatures with simple abilities that aren't really what we're looking to do in Commander. And you'll see that what we really want to run are worms that are 6 mana or higher. But in those higher mana costs, we do have some really good stuff mixed in there. Our top end is things like Wurmcoil Engine, Worldspire Wurm, Penumbra Wurm, and the new Defiler of Vigor. Big, stompy green creatures that represent a huge threat on the board. It's just a shame that by the time we're able to cast such beauties, a normal Commander game would almost be over. Outside of the tribe, there also isn't a whole lot of support. Garrick Primal Hunter can make worms with his ultimate ability, but not really something we can rely on. And most of the token generators are either worms themselves, or have a similar mana value as our worms anyway. So how do we build such a tribal deck? We have terrible commanders and a rather restricted creature pool. While Growth Armor is an interesting commander, I don't think he's worth running as our worm commander. Instead, I think we'd have to stick with Baru, since at least he won't actively cause us to lose the game by drawing our opponent's cards. For the deck design, we're then left with two viable choices. Either we lean into the changelings to help fill out the bottom end of our mana curve, or we screw the rules and build a deck that ramps and worms. The changeling route is fairly straightforward, and if you're going to go down that route anyway, running Moretti of the Frost may actually be a better choice than Baru. I would build this deck with a fairly standard mana curve, using changelings to fill out the lower half, and of course our worms at the top. And then we want plenty of ways to cheat creatures off the top of our library and out of our hand. Things like Descendant's Path, Kindred Summons, Lurking Predators and such. We'd also have access to blue to help control what's on top of our library, and Moretti would become an actual worm if copying one that's already in play. On the other hand, the Baru all ramp deck would be very different. You'd want to lean into heavy ramp and play only perhaps 15 actual worms. Basically only the good ones. Then you use the full gamut of green ramp to get as much mana as fast as possible. Maybe even putting in some mana doublers as well just to get some more ramp up and running. The aim here would be to get to our 6 to 8 mana by turn 5 so that we aren't too far behind the table by the time we start dropping Wurms. In both decks, however, there is one creature that isn't a worm that is really worth considering, and that is Elvish Piper, who can help cheat them out of our hand. Sometimes our bad tribes need a little bit of help, and Elvish Piper is just one of the best green creatures to help deal with our mana curve problem. More generally, the upsides of a worm deck is that they are mostly big creatures, so green card draw works really well once you get them out, and they will pose a powerful board presence for our opponents to deal with. They also work great with the green fight removal, since most of the time our worms will be bigger than anything our opponents have. There are potentially some combo lines if you wanted to go down that route as well, though it doesn't really suit the deck. Several of our worms make tokens when they die, such as Worm Coil Engine and Symbiotic Worm, who you could then use with an Astronaut's Altar and a Nim Death Mantle to loop with. But the tribe doesn't really lend itself to graveyard combos very much, so it's not the best way to add combo to this deck. So we come back to our original question. Are worms a playable tribe? In my opinion, it's borderline, even with the new Barrow, as they are lacking in several key areas. The creatures are pretty one note, and the commanders don't really help the strategy that much. But with a focus around ramping and cheating worms into play, there may be just enough big threatening worms to make the deck like that function. You would definitely need to play some ways to cheat them out, or some changelings to help fill out your curve, but there is a functional deck within this tribe. At most, you are only going to be looking at a mid-power deck, however, as they don't lend themselves to combo lines or fast kills. A deck built around ramp and control for the early game, with big creatures to drop in later, is a perfectly solid deck design, and tribes like Eldrazi do that already. You just have to be careful and run a tight selection of worms with tutors, rather than filling out the entire deck with 30 of them and wondering why you can't cast anything. To turn them from a bad tribe into a good one, they really need a small worm commander, much like what Gaeta did for Angels, that lowers their cost and gives a consistent early game. They also just need more density at the lower mana cost. Some 3 and 4 mana worms would really help smooth out that mana curve. But they aren't that far from being good, and if we're lucky, we'll see some more support in the coming years. I hope this helped if you're planning a worm deck, and giving you some ideas for how this tribe can be built. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.